Hi guys, welcome back. Welcome to the FSX 404 channel. Today we're going to do an approach into the number 5 most extreme airport according to the History channel. The airport is Gibraltar Airport, LXGB. At first glance, the Gibraltar Airport does not seem like anything special. It does have a few quirks in it. It has a road that runs in the middle of it, and we're talking a main road where vehicles and pedestrians pass. The second little thing about Gibraltar Airport is important because Gibraltar, according to the Spanish, is really a disputed territory. According to the English, it belongs to them. So what happens is, because Gibraltar Airport is so close to Spain, the Spanish get sensitive about the airspace, and sometimes the airplanes have to stay out of the airspace. And for our approach today, we are going to avoid the Spanish airspace. We're going to do the harder approach. We're going to do the military approach, but we're going to do it in a civilian airplane. We'll talk about that in just a second. The last and the most important thing that makes Gibraltar Airport hard is that because of that Gibraltar rock, or that Gibraltar mini mountain that is located right next to the airport, as the wind comes over it and around it, it creates this very nasty turbulence right over the runway, and it hits the airplanes just as they're trying to land. So the pilots have to be ready for this. And if we look at the approach plate, they have a nice little section depicting turbulence on the approach plate itself that pilots can look at, see the wind direction, and then expect that turbulence accordingly. Now what I did to simulate this turbulence is that every 10 feet I've added different wind directions with moderate to severe turbulence and moderate to severe wind shear. So as we're going to be coming to land, every 10 feet we'll have the wind hit us from different side and in a way simulate what happens at Gibraltar. Now let's get into the approach plates. Today we're going to do the SRE Runway 09 approach. Now this approach is used by the military airplanes, and we're talking about the British military airplanes. And because of that, it's very important for those airplanes to stay out of that Spanish airspace. And because the airplanes have to try to stay out of that Spanish airspace, the approach can be a little harder than the civilian approach, but it's very similar in a way. Now first of all, what is the SRE approach? The SRE approach is a surveillance radar approach. Now what does this mean? This means that the ATC from the ground will give you your position and your distance from the airport. If we look at the approach plate that we're going to do, the SRE Runway 09, we can see that we have a 10-mile radar fix. This 10-mile radar fix is actually the point called Bravo. If we go up into the arrival part of the approach plates, we can see the arrival routes. One comes from the point Alpha to Bravo, and then from Bravo you begin the actual approach. And the other one comes from the point Charlie, then from Charlie we fly to the point Bravo and then begin our approach. So that 10-mile radar fix is actually the point Bravo. This 10-mile radar fix, we can put this fix in the Microsoft Flight Simulator. What we're going to do for the Microsoft Flight Simulator, we're going to pick the two GPS points, we're going to pick the point Alpha, and then we're going to fly to point Bravo and then begin our approach, or we're going to pick a point Charlie, then fly to point Bravo and then begin our approach. Once we get to this point Bravo, this 10 nautical mile radar fix, we're going to fly a heading of 346. We're not going to have any instrument guidance other than our heading indicator to stay on this heading of 346. Now, while we are flying this heading of 346, the ATC will give us our distances: 6 nautical miles, 5 nautical miles, 3 nautical miles. Now, we don't have that in Microsoft Flight Simulator. So how are we going to do that in Microsoft Flight Simulator? We're going to get around it by the airplanes we use. In this case, I will use the Airbus 319, and I'll show you what I did in the Airbus 319 to overcome this problem once we get into the flight part of this video. And then from there, you guys can choose your own airplanes and do something similar and try to do this approach. If we look at the profile, at the 10-mile radar fix, or the point Bravo, we're going to say, well, wait a minute, there's no altitude. So what are we going to do for that? Well, I'm going to give you the altitude. And I'm going to use some experienced guesses to give you the altitude. If we're coming from point Alpha, we're going to be at a minimum of 3,000 feet. And as we come to Bravo, we're going to descend down to 2,100 feet. If we're coming from point Charlie, we're going to be at a minimum of 4,000 feet. And then from that point Charlie, as we're going to point Bravo, we're going to descend down to 2,100 feet. So over the point Bravo, we're going to be at 2,100 feet. Now let's go to the profile to get the altitudes for these points, the 10 mile, 6 mile, 5 mile, and 3 mile points. From the profile, remember I said at point Bravo, the 10 nautical mile point, we're going to be at 2,100 feet. After that 2,100 feet at 10 miles, on a heading of 346, we're going to do a step down descent. So that means over the 10 mile point, over the Bravo point, we're going to do an immediate descent down to 1,520 feet Once we reach 1,520 feet, we're going to maintain 1,520 feet until we reach the 5-mile radar fix. This 5-mile point is our final approach fix. That means this is where we're going to put our landing gear down, and this is where we're going to do the first pre-landing checklist. And there's one more thing that's going to happen at this 5-mile nautical point. Now, at the 5-mile point, we're going to start a descent down to our decision height. The decision height for this approach is 1,000 feet. But for this last part, from 5 miles to 3 miles, if we look below, they have given us a descent gradient. The descent gradient from 5 nautical mile radar fix to the MAP with missed approach point, which is the 3-mile fix. The 3-mile radar fix is the visual decision point, or the MAP, the missed approach point. So the descent gradient from 5 miles to the MAP missed approach point is 4.9 degrees. What does this mean to us? Well, let's look at our ground approach speed. At a ground speed of 140 knots, 695 feet per minute rate of descent. For a ground speed of 160 knots, 794 feet per minute rate of descent. Our ground speed during this last part of the approach will be around 150 knots. So our rate of descent from the 5-mile point to the 3-mile point will be around 750 feet per minute. Now what's going to happen to the 3-mile point? From the 3-mile point, the approach is completely 100% visual. If we have the runway or the runway lights in sight, we'll go for a landing. If we don't have the runway or the runway lights in sight, we're going for a missed approach. Now really quick, there's one more thing we need to go over for landing at Gibraltar. The last part from the 3-mile point radar fix. That is of course going to be 100% visual. But if we look at the visual approach chart, we can see that the approach is guiding us to a flashing white light. So what's going to happen is that 3-mile point, as we're spotting the airport, we're going to start looking for the little flashing light in the water. Once we spot the little flashing light in the water, we're going to turn our airplane to that flashing light, and then from that flashing light we'll turn onto the runway. It should be a nice, easy, gentle turn onto the runway. We're going to set the airplane a couple of miles away from the point Bravo, and once we get into the cockpit, that's where we're going to pick up our approach. For this approach, we're going to use the Wilco Field Air Airbus 319. So let's get into the airplane and let's fly this approach.